Hello and welcome to Spencer's Library. I'm Claudia and this is the Bookish Boxes and Buzzwords tag. I just had to make sure that I read that off a piece of paper because otherwise I would be getting the title wrong. This tag is all about what makes me want to pick up a book. I was tagged by Miriam from Between Lines and Life, so thank you very much for that tag. It's a really interesting set of questions and I have lots and lots of books to show you. I'm not entirely sure who the original creator of the tag was because clearly I haven't done my research, but I will make sure to link their video in the description box as well as Miriam's video. Beetle, can you just stop? I think he's now trapped in the cardboard box. Let me just go and sort him out. What are you doing, you silly? What are you doing? Question 1. What is your go-to genre or favourite type of book? I thought long and hard about this. I don't think I have a favourite genre, but my favourite type of book is an old book, and by that I mean a classic, or what I define as a classic, which is a book written before 1960. I don't know why I'm drawn to old books. I think I just like reading about the past from the perspective of someone who's actually lived it. For example, when I pick up a historical novel, meaning a book that's written in 2017, for example, and set in 1817, then there's a lot of over-describing of everyday life. So, for example, and then Elizabeth got into the carriage, which had a seat in the front and a seat in the back and was drawn by 2 horses, and it took her 7 hours to get from one town to the next, and this is what it felt like to be in the carriage, and so on. Whereas when I read a book that's actually from 1817, it's just assumed that the reader knows what a carriage ride is, and I like that sort of everyday handling of the past because it still seems like a miracle to me that people actually lived in 1817. And I just love reading about old time periods from the perspective of someone who lived them and who didn't know anything else. Question 2. What are retellings that you're drawn to? First I thought, I don't really read retellings. But then thinking about it, there's one type of story that I do love, and I guess you could say that that's a retelling of Cinderella. So that's the kind of rags to riches story, or alternatively the kind of princess that has been made to live with peasants. And of course my favourite version of that story is Harry Potter. And yes, Harry Potter, deep down, is a Cinderella retelling. Question 3. What are lifestyles and careers that you're drawn to? So I like books that analyse society. So I'm drawn to characters who work in environments where they deal with that. So, you know, teachers, politicians, rich landlords and landladies, that sort of thing. Examples of authors who write about characters like that would be, for example, E.M. Forster or Charlotte Bronte or Oscar Wilde. Question 4. What places and settings are you drawn to? There are quite a few places and settings that I love. One of them is big country houses in the English countryside, and examples of that are all of the classics, including, you know, Jane Austen and E.M. Forster and Charlotte Bronte and Oscar Wilde, and all of these authors that I've literally just mentioned. They all tend to be set in these kind of big houses. I also love visiting manor houses, and living in Britain there's quite a lot of them. Manor houses, castles, country houses, even things like Elizabethan townhouses. You'll just find around every corner here, and I love going to see those. Another setting I love is boarding schools. In fact, I did a whole video about how much I love boarding school novels, which boarding school novels are the best and why you should read them. That video is going to be linked up in the corner, down in the description box. Go check that out. I'm really quite proud of that video. Examples of boarding school novels. I mean, there are lots of them. Of course, there's Harry Potter. Actually, one recent example that I'm just listening to at the moment as an audiobook is the book Red Sister by Mark Lawrence. This is a fantasy book set in a convent, and the main character is a novice. And it's practically a boarding school. A lot of the book is about lessons and teachers and classmates, and I'm enjoying that quite a lot at the moment. Another completely different setting that I enjoy is a sort of dystopian, apocalyptic survival setting. And a recent favourite of that genre is The Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham, which I read earlier this year. And I like settings where the main characters have to fight for their survival and have to be creative with the resources that they have. Another setting I enjoy is the home. And that goes hand in hand with my love for old books, because a lot of 19th century books are domestic novels, meaning books that are set in the home and that deal with what's going on inside the home. So examples of that are, again, Jane Austen novels, but even more modern books like I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith, which is almost entirely set inside that castle that the family lives in. Those books tend to be focused on the female experience a lot, which I also enjoy reading about. My most recent domestic novel read is the mid-century classic Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, which is set in a big country house called Manderley, and it's creepy and wonderfully written, and I can highly recommend that. What else do we have here? Ian Forster's Howard's End, which is not as domestic as the title makes you think, because Howard's End is a house and it does play a central role in the book, but the story is not set in the house for the most part. Question 5. What are relationships that you're drawn to? So I really enjoy reading about sibling relationships in stories, and again, I'm going to list Jane Austen. One of my favourite sibling relationships of hers is between the sisters in Sense and Sensibility. There's 3 sisters in that, but the 2 elder ones have a really close friendship, even though they're very different, and it's interesting to read about those differences and how they deal with those. There's also the children's classic Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. I also like friendships between children in books especially, and one of my favourite reads for that is the German children's classic Puenktchen und Anton by Erich Kaestner. I'm not entirely sure what the English title is of that, but it'll be listed in my list of books in the description box. This is a beautiful story about the friendship between 2 kids from very different circumstances. In terms of romantic relationships, I really like the will they, won't they trope that I guess people are familiar with from stories like Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen or Much Ado About Nothing by William Shakespeare. You know, that kind of thing where you have 2 characters that dislike each other, but there is tension all along. Yes, it's a massive cliche, but oh, how I love it. Question 6. What are some buzzwords you look for in the title? I looked through my recent reads on Goodreads for that, and I genuinely cannot find any words that stand out as being something I'm drawn to. Question 7. What are things on book covers that draw you to them? So the book covers I'm drawn to tend to be quite simple, like this one, which is Gilead by Marilynne Robinson. You know, it's just got a very simple kind of window pattern in a pretty colour. There's also this old edition of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, you know, very plain covers. I do like the look of those. Here's another one, Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. Again, very plain, very simple. And another example of the sort of cover I like is this one, The Ode Less Travelled by Stephen Fry. Question 8. What kind of non-fiction are you drawn to? So there are 2 types of non-fiction books that I'm drawn to. One of them is historical non-fiction. So books that talk about how people lived in the past. And the past can be anything from the 19th century to prehistoric times. Again, this is a bit silly, but it always baffles me that people actually lived in the past. and I love reading about how they dealt with daily life. Some of my favourite topics include things like food history, what did people used to cook? Like, I can't imagine living 1,000 years back and not having access to potatoes. It's such a silly thing, but I love thinking about stuff like that. One of my favourite reads about that from the last few years was SPQR by, what's her name? By Mary Beard. That was just a wonderful book about the Roman Empire. Very big and long, but surprisingly easy to read. Another type of non-fiction book that I'm reading more and more of, and that I'm feeling more drawn to recently, is books about current modern day society. So books that deal with issues of politics and culture of today. My most recent favourite is Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Reni Eddo-Lodge, which was a wonderful read and the first non-fiction book I've ever given 5 stars to. And that book is specifically about racism in Britain and the history of racism in Britain. So it talks both about issues of today and then explains how racism has evolved and in the past few hundred years. Question 9. Medical or physical conditions of characters? No, I don't think there is anything in particular that I'm drawn to. I read about all sorts of characters with all sorts of different characteristics, both physical and personality-wise. I guess I slightly prefer reading about female characters as opposed to male characters, but I wouldn't call that a medical condition. Question 10. Time in history or time of year that you're drawn to? So one of my favourite eras to read about is the early 19th century, and I have a professional interest in the early 19th century, so I enjoy reading about that. But I'm also trying to find more books that are set in the medieval era or even before, so ancient times or prehistoric times. I'd love to read a historical novel set in prehistoric times, so if you have any good recommendations for that, please leave them down below. That was all the 10 main questions. There's 2 bonus questions which I'll also answer. Bonus question number 1, are there any other boxes or buzzwords? So I guess that's any other tropes that attract me to a book. And I suppose I have a slight preference for standalone novels over series. I don't really want to commit to a series most of the time. But funnily enough, when I do find a series that I love, then I really get into it. Bonus question number 2 is things that turn you off. And there is one type of character that I don't like reading about, and that is musicians. The reason being, I'm tired of the sort of romanticization of the character of the musician. Having been a musician and having been around musicians for most of my adult life, I'm just bored of this trope of the tortured artist. It's just not very realistic. I think most musicians see music as more of a craft and see their job as more of a mundane 9-to-5 rather than this expression of your inner soul, which of course you have to have a love for music in order to become a musician, but it's not like you're going to literally die if you don't play music. I think authors get that wrong a lot of the time, so I don't enjoy reading about musicians. And this was the Bookish boxes and buzzwords tag. Of course, I've forgotten to tag people or to think about who I'm going to tag. Miriam, who tagged me, tagged a lot of people, so I would recommend going to her video, checking that out, and then just following up on people who've done this tag as well. I think this is a really interesting set of questions, and I really enjoyed thinking about my own reading habits because it's not something I analyse a lot, as you can probably tell by this video. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Bye.